Good afternoon, welcome back, bienvenue à notre panel. Je suis très heureuse de vous rassembler après le lunch. Donc, de vous accueillir ici au nom de Coalition Publica. Je suis la directrice générale du consortium Érudit et je co-lead Coalition Publica ensemble avec ma collègue Teresa Lee, the brand new managing director of the Public Knowledge Project. She will be here next year. As many of you know, Erides and PKP's mission is to make open access and open science the default by coordinating shared digital infrastructure, open platforms and tools, services, and governance structure across Canadian and international community. You cannot hear me? Closer to the mic. Am I coming over correctly? Yeah. Okay. Before introducing the panel today, I will talk a little bit more about Coalition Publica. It won't be long, but I think it's important also to set the table on what we do as a major science initiative. Coalition Publica are the leading experts when it comes to publication and text as data. And together with our colleagues from the CRDCN, Natalie is here today with us. We are the only two MSIs covering social sciences and humanities. We are providing research communities in HSS with digital infrastructure to conduct and disseminate research as text as a key element of their endeavors. Coalition Publica's infrastructure is made out of two main elements supporting digital publishing workflows and research dissemination. On one hand, you have the tool that probably as researchers, a lot of you come across, and mainly you haven't seen it because sometimes infrastructure is really invisible if it's well done. So I'm talking about open journal systems, very heavily used in Canada, but with an enormous worldwide reach. This past year, the number of journals worldwide using this tool with software to do publications worldwide has grown to more than 58,000 installations over the world in more than 150 countries, all made in Canada. And all this while maintaining multilingual support for this software in more than 60 languages. And on the other hand, we have the erudit.org platform, visited annually by more than 5 million users. And these users come from Canada, of course, but also really with a very strong international readership. Érudit offers from a single access point access to a large majority of Canadian journals in humanities and social sciences, provides articles in French and English and other languages with critical knowledge about our Canadian society, about issues and challenges that are directly related to our Canadian people's life, from public policy to practice of law, from our education system to the multifaceted process of aging, economic analysis, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And you all know the phrase publish or perish. And let me say what I would say, that we are all trapped also by a publishing system that is ruled by a few big multinationals, where the question of open access and of this kind of infrastructure for publishing is transformed into a source for profit. And this system, as researchers, you have to pay to publish articles, and you have to pay to have your essential knowledge seen and read out in the world. As university administrators, you sometimes also have to pay then these same companies considerable fees to access data about your researchers' publication output in the university and the impact of your universities. Funders, on the other hand, have no way of monitoring the public outcome of publicly funded research. So with Coalition Publica, and thanks to the support and the vision of CFI and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Le Fonds de Recherche du Québec, and others, namely our universities that support us, We can count in Canada on independent and sovereign scholar and publishing and dissemination infrastructure that we provide together through our Endeavor Coalition Publica. And now, why do we think that it's important to talk about this topic of misinformation and mistrust in science? Before we begin, I really would like to be very clear that about the spirit of this panel. None of us here, I think, would claim to be an expert on this topic. Not all. This is not what the conversation is about. Instead, we come to this discussion this afternoon with the perspective of people who build, run, and rely on research infrastructure. And from that point, it's becoming, I think, increasingly clear that questions of trust, openness, and credibility are no longer side topics, but they are really a big part of the environment we operate in. So today is not about providing definitive answers, unless you have, nor about diagnosing misinformation in detail. It's about reflecting collectively on what responsibility and opportunity look like for major scientific infrastructures like ours, like you here in the room, in a broader context, especially when trust in science can no longer be taken for granted. In the course of this panel, you will be invited to contribute and to stand up and to talk, to contribute to the discussion, not with Mentimeter, not with technology, but with your hands, with the mic, and with postcards that you have on your tables, where we invite you to note just your thoughts and to come back with this in the course of the panel. I'm very delighted now to introduce our three honorable panelists. Natalie Harrower, Executive Director of the Canadian Research Data Centre Network. Natalie is an advocate for open science practices in the research ecosystem, particularly in research infrastructures for data, for the humanities, social sciences, and cultural heritage. She has previously participated in international, notably European instances of discussion on the perils of misinformation. She will speak from the perspective of a social sciences infrastructure that provides trusted, secure, high-quality statistics and administrative data on Canadian society. Rob Annan, President and CEO of Genome Canada. Rob combines a background in genomics research with deep knowledge of science and innovation policy, a strong believer that science and innovation, when equitably applied, can make life better. He works with researchers, policy leaders, and industry across Canada and internationally to help realize the economic, environmental, and social benefits of genomics. He will contribute to the panel in sharing a perspective on the challenges faced by biomedical research in the post-pandemic context. And last but not least, Frédéric Bouchard, who's also the chair of Érudit and Coalition Publica. And Frédéric is the doyen de la Faculté des Arts et des Sciences et professeur titulaire au département de philosophie de l'Université de Montréal. Philosophe des sciences, ses recherches interdisciplinaires portent sur les relations entre l'expertise, la science et la société, ainsi que sur les fondements théoriques de la biologie évolutionnaire et de l'écologie. And you are very likely also familiar with the Bouchard report, which outlines key findings and recommendations to strengthen the science and research support system in Canada. And now we are deep diving into the topic. I would like to mention a report that came across my desk, which has been published in 2024 by the Canadian government that identifies and assesses 35 disruptions for which Canada may need to prepare and explore some of the interconnections even between them. The report is called The Disruptions on the Horizon. And in this report, the number one disruption has actually been identified as the most likely to happen, which is people cannot tell anymore what is true and what is not. Natalie, what is for you the biggest threat or challenge related to misinformation in the context of CRDCN?
Whoops, better not touch that. Thanks so much for the introduction, Tanya. Happy to be here. The research that comes out of the Canadian Research Data Centre Network addresses a really wide range of social, economic, and population health questions. And these often have a very direct relationship to policies and programming by different levels of government. And there's a lot of interest in how these programs or policy decisions affect Canadian lives and households and businesses, which means that they hit on what I would call hot topics of public debate. And these hot topics, we could call them hot-headed topics sometimes in terms of the response, include things like discussions around immigration, distribution of social benefits, housing, and so on. They can be quite emotive, I guess, and can provide fertile ground for a lot of personal opinion and sometimes ideologically driven viewpoints. So I think in terms of a threat, we're sort of in the territory where discussions that, misinformation can arise. And I see that as a bit of a threat. But at the same time, in the larger context, trust in government, I think, and in public data coming out of government is waning, particularly around some of the political extremes. And studies can be misinterpreted. So you said, sometimes it's hard to know what is true. And interpretation can be intentional. It can be non-intentional. It can be used to fit particular narratives. Evidence can be read in selective or intentionally narrow and inaccurate ways. So I guess that's what I see as some of the biggest threats when it comes to the work that is done by researchers at CRDCN. And the need for data and much more widespread digital literacy is quite clear in terms of this sort of threat.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Rob, would you like to add something from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks to the organizers for the invite. So I think my comments will come from the perspective, of course, of Genome Canada, and I assume most people know who we are working in genomics in health, but in other areas as well. But I think that they can be generalized to a lot of science, other fields, and so on. And for me, the clearest threat that we face when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, is the risk to the social license that we have to do the work that we do. Science doesn't happen in a vacuum. Very tangibly and directly, of course, we receive our funding through public taxpayer funds that are allocated by governments, and it's a competitive landscape when we think about how those funds are being allocated. We can't take that support for granted. But beyond that, it's also the context in which we work, and that is in communities, that is the recruitment of students, that is the deployment of technologies, and so on. And if we lose that social license, and then it makes it very difficult to be able to do the kind of work and have the kinds of impacts we know we can have. And so what do we mean by social license? I mean, social license is really the sense that that science is providing to the public results that it finds valuable and that it finds useful and that it finds aligns with the goals and interests of that public. And misinformation muddies the waters, right? We see this happening currently, of course, south of the border. We think about mRNA vaccines and the sudden challenges that companies, academic institutions, hospitals are finding working in that space, as the administration is suggesting that they will no longer support the approval of mRNA vaccines. And we're seeing a pullback now in investments in research, both on the academic side and the industry side. And it's easy to point to, a Secretary of Health or a president and say, well, that's because they're off the rock or whatever it is. But they're the tip of a bigger iceberg. And that a bigger iceberg is that kind of social understanding and acceptance that creates the environment in which we can do this work. And it's not just this. We saw the same thing happen 25 years ago in the US with stem cells. In our space, we saw the same kind of challenges in the earliest days around GMOs. And I think that given the noise in the system and both, the intentional and maybe inadvertent misinformation, a public that starts to say, well, we're not so sure this is a great idea, we could find that it's not just our funding that gets cut off, but actually the social environment that allows us to do the work could become, if not supportive, even hostile. to our work. And I think that's a real threat. I think it's something that we can't sleep on.
Thank you very much. Social license.
Well,
Maybe you will like to add.
begin by recognizing that social license is because we must not forget it. All of our MSIs and the institutions we're involved with. Thanks a lot, CFI. I just want to say no because CFI, the departments, whether it's ISED or whether it's health or whether it's agriculture or fisheries, or there are all these departments that and agencies, Shirk in the case of Érudit has done a lot of support, and we work with other funding agencies as well. But you were talking about kind of the various actors that need to believe that this is important stuff for these results to emerge. So I just want to take a moment to thank CFI for the support, not just financial, although keep it up, but also moral and operational. It's very important. But this gets. I'm going to get philosophical for a second, but it's I'm getting to believe, especially when you brought up the point that when you start not knowing what is true and what is not, right? When you're starting to muddle knowledge, it becomes impossible to live, together, right? Because you don't understand the interactions you have. You don't trust each other. I'm not talking about science. I'm just talking about society, right? So if you start attacking knowledge, and true is maybe too strong, but let's say accept the knowledge of the best quality you can have access to, right? And can be generated various ways. But once you lose that, it becomes impossible to have dialogue, exchange, sharing, trust. And so I'm getting to the point where I genuinely believe that scientific institutions are keystones to living together harmoniously. So yes, of course, jobs, of course, productivity, of course, yes, all of that. But more bedrock is that we're some of the few institutions that still have some trust. So when you look at trust in institutions in civil society and trust in various professionals, scientists' trust is still very high. So there's no crisis in trust in scientists, right? So it's still high. It has been declining since COVID, but we come from a very top position. If you ask journalists, if you ask elected officials, the trust has been going down for the last few decades, right? So trust in science is high. Trust in institutions in general, that is hurting, not universities in particular, right? Institutions, any and all institutions. And so the question is, okay, so we know we need kind of recognizable knowledge, right? That we can disagree with, but we need something something stable to disagree about. And if you need institutions in society for democracy to work, then you think, okay, so what key institutions can we build a good, happy society on? And so I'll overreach here. And I would say, well, that's MSI, right? No, it's not MSI, but it's scientific institutions in general. So scientific institutions not only are important for the knowledge they generate, but for anchoring civil discourse beyond the knowledge, because we care about good knowledge. We share knowledge. Érudit and PKP, we literally give it away, right? I mean, it's important to understand that sharing knowledge has a very powerful impact on others. And so in those terms, thinking in terms of threats or challenges, I would flip it. It's also the opportunity is that scientific institutions play a unique role in civil society, not just in producing knowledge and innovation, but anchoring the possibility of having civil dialogue. We're not the only ones doing it, but we do it really well. And so when we think about this comes with great responsibilities for us, each and every single institutions here, you have stakeholders. Sometimes it's community groups, sometimes it's private companies, sometimes they come to you because you do something special. That's a huge responsibility, right? It's not just money and knowledge. It's you're building trust at every positive collaboration, saying, oh, maybe I'm not insane trusting in an institution, right? I mean, you are trustworthy institution. And that's huge. So the challenge is kind of everywhere. It's not specific to us. We have a unique role and unique responsibility in responding to this distrust, both on the knowledge part, kind of generating stable, recognizable knowledge. Stable is not the right word. Well-established knowledge. And the fact that the way we conduct ourselves in our operations, if we behave like institutions that are exemplary, is not as a moral term, but as kind of a fiduciary term, is if we do that, and we do, then in some sense we increase the license to trust in other institutions. And so anyway, so it's the responsibility. Like, we have a huge responsibility, and we're very lucky to be able to play that role.
Maybe that's a good segue, actually, to the second question about how our institutions contribute to the critical thinking in our society in order to remain in trust and to continue in that sense. Rob, I would hand it over to you.
Yeah. So I think that's a good question. I'll build off of this idea of institutional trust and think about critical thinking. I agree with Frédéric that institutions are able to, I think, embody a certain amount of trust and stand as a like a signifier and symbol for body of knowledge and understanding, and also motivation and impact that can help advance that trust. At the same time, I worry that we're drawing down on existing capital when it comes to societal trust in our institutions. So you stand up an organization like Genome Canada. It's funded by the federal government. It is supported by provincial governments. It has an office. It has people. It has a board, et cetera. Institutions like the MSIs. You're based in a university. You have a logo. You've got important people, et cetera. Those are all signifiers. The public's like, these must be serious organizations. But the foundation for those assumptions is eroding, in my opinion. And that kind of assumption of trust in institutions is something we can't continue to take. And I'm not suggesting say we should take it for granted, but I think we need to be very alive and awake to the idea that we need to be investing in the regeneration of that social trust in our institutions. And this gets to this concept of critical thinking. And I think that I want to take this in a little bit of a bit of a twist, because critical thinking is something that generally you want a lot of other people to be doing, right? Because like, you've got the good ideas, they're clearly not thinking critically enough. And if they did, they would start agreeing with you more, right? So it's like, how do we encourage more critical thinking by the people who don't agree with us? And then they'll be like, oh, I had these wrong ideas and now I believe in science. Okay, that's fine. That's one way of looking at it. But I think we all need to be engaging in critical thinking. What are the blind spots that we have as institutions? What are the assumptions that we're making when it comes to engaging with the public, with the end users, with the patients, with the funders? How do we think critically about our own role? We know we're good people trying to do good in the world, right? We're all confident in that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that others on the outside see it the same way. We need to be able to think with a critical lens, and I would argue with empathy, which I think is a big driver in a lot of this work around miscommunication, misinformation. The empathy to understand, well, what do they think? How do they see our institution? Maybe they're not wrong. Maybe it's not just a case of like, if they just thought more critically, they'd realize how great we are. Or if we gave them the right information, they would suddenly see the light. We need to think critically as well as institutional leaders about, well, what is it that our critics are concerned about? What drives they might be wrong about what mRNA is going to do inside their body, right? Hammering them with biochemistry and cell biology is not going to change their minds. Having them think critically about, well, you got that information from Facebook and this is a publication from Science, right? That kind of critical thinking is, theoretically true, but it's not practically true in the real world. We can engage in, well, what is it that what's driving their belief here? And it's probably fear, right? It's fear because this is a new technology they had never heard of. And now there's a mandate that they have to put in their arm. They're not sure what's going on. Having an empathy as to what's driving that, allowing us to think critically about how we're perceived by the public, I think goes a long way to giving us a bit of a path to starting to address what's driving those concerns and rebuilding some of the institutional trust.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Would like to
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a really interesting line of discussion because critical thinking can be interpreted in so many different ways. There's critique. There's sometimes skepticism subs in for critical thinking, I think, in different cases. So the context around it, I think that you're mentioning, Rob, is really key. Just to get back to your original question, Tanya, around critical thinking and how our research infrastructures can help to develop that. So the researchers at CRDCN are working with very high quality statistical data from Stats Canada, which is a well-respected institution, a deservedly so well-respected institution internationally as well. And CRDCN is a partnership with them, funded by CFI and, of course, SSHRC and CAHR. So lots of strong and respected institutions backing the infrastructure. From the perspective of quantitative social science researchers, critical thinking is about, in a sense, understanding the power of statistical analysis, but also knowing its limits and the potential for bias or error. There's a well-cited paper in Stats that talks about how a given data set, so meant to be an objective, this is an objective, a highly curated set of information that we can work from. But any given data set can be analyzed in entirely different kinds of ways, right? Choices around what statistical test to perform, but also decisions on what data to include, exclude, what interactions to consider. These are all larger social, political, economic questions that have to be taken into consideration, right? It doesn't come out of just the analysis itself. So the familiar phrase everyone knows is correlation does not equal causation, right? Everyone's heard that. So scholars have to be careful about samples they use, the code they write, but also this broader social economic context in which their studies take place. And this is where critical thinking really comes into place. And it's not entirely a taught skill. And I think this is going along the side of what you said, Rob, not quite the same thing, but it aligns. It's also about experience, about exchange with peers, going to conferences, testing your ideas, subjecting it to scrutiny. So broader engagement, professional debate. My colleague, Grant Gibson at CRDCN said, there's no substitute for spending time hearing people who know what they're doing think through out loud an empirical problem and think through their own kinds of processes. So I think these sorts of things really underline the value of national research infrastructure because they provide a full support system. It's not just access, in our case, just access to the data. It's a peer system, centralized training, knowledge mobilization, the time and the place. So structured development of the elements required to practice critical thinking in a fulsome kind of way.
Yeah, thank you.
It's so the Érudit, so Coalition Publica has various partners. I'm mostly involved with Érudit on a, well, not daily basis because that's Chania, but I've been involved mostly with Érudit, and the mission of Érudit and PKP at SFU is basically to give the knowledge that is produced by our scholars and researchers. So it is started by research in social science and humanities, mostly in French, and because there was a worry that because of big commercial publishers, since there was not a lot of money to be made from research, from publishing research in social science and humanities in the French language, that we wouldn't be able to have our own, platforms to do it. So that was the initial idea, is make sure we have, we talk a lot about science sovereignty these days or digital sovereignty. Well, basically, Érudit was founded with this idea in mind. And then it got broader and broader because it's not just about French. It's not just about social science and humanities. But the question of open access and it's not obvious for all of the platforms here, right? So I'm not giving a universal solution here, but trying to be as open access as possible and as quickly as possible. And of course, various rates in various fields and various hindrances, trying to avoid commercial open access just because you're just putting the costs, you're just taking money away from more graduate fellowships and stipends, right? Because you're trying to pay someone for open access. I'll stop the editorial there, but basically it's giving this knowledge away or making it as accessible as possible makes it possible for both individuals and collectives to be critically thinking. And so érudit, I've done tons of things in my career, and the ones I've gotten the most kind of recognition were érudit. Like I would go to my daughter's high school and talk about certain things, and somehow érudit comes up, says, "Oh yeah, I use that all the time." So you've got high schoolers, you've got college students, you've got journalists, you've got political attachés that are doing searches on a topic. And if you make your data, or your data is not the right example, but if you make your research as easily available as possible, you've got non-academics who are going to use it, and it's going to empower them. And if you empower people, they're going to feel good about you. And so the question of critical thinking, I think, should be addressed both obviously for the researchers and our students, but it's way beyond that. Is the work we do allows people to ask their own question. And if we help people, if we trust people to ask their own questions, this gets to the empathy question. It's legitimate to be worried, right? So it's a good idea to ask questions. The way we respond to that is crucial.
Yeah.
And if we say you don't need to know it, or no, trust us in, like, obey me, right? That's not going to work. But if we say, listen, I trust you enough that I'm going to explain it to you, or I'm going to share the knowledge with you, then we have critical thinking both at the individual level, but at the collective level. And then, again, you empower various organizations and individuals. They're stronger because they interact with you. And so this helps you, you're helping them. And so the critical thinking should be thought of beyond the individual level, but kind of the overall capacity that it provides society.
Thank you very much for this insight. I'm changing a little bit direction now. Around érudit, we do with the data a lot of standardization and, looking at norms and so on and so on. Natalie, how do you work on making data reliable in your context?
So how do we what makes data reliable, or how do we do it? Yeah. I think transparency is really key, and we've been circling around that concept, I think, with everything that we're saying up here. So when it comes to the data that researchers work with for us, transparency about the data's provenance, where did it come from, the history, the credibility of the data collector, these are all key. The chain of custody, any kinds of transformations that take place to the data through anonymization. So these are all different steps, but it's about ensuring that those things are also communicated readily and openly, because this sort of transparency and the documentation around it is what makes it useful. So a data set can be full of all sorts of rich information that is ready for study, but if it doesn't have that contextual information provided with it, and that's the work, there's a lot of work in doing that contextual information. If it doesn't have that, it's pretty much useless. I've talked in this room before about FAIR principles. I'm a fan of this element of open science, and the R in FAIR is about reusability, and that very much relates to the ability for researchers to take what was collected and curated in a certain way and do something with it that can pull the accurate kinds of results. And that's hard to do when you're dealing with massively complex data sets. Data sets that are actually challenging the limits of our storage architecture. They're so big, even though there are lots of ones and zeros. We're in a really good situation with this because, as I said, Stats Canada has a very strong institutional history. Their data are very reliable, and they're often used to test the reliability of other data sets. So you can play these things off one another. There's some challenges around this because large, well-funded organizations have the capacity to do the kind of pre-work, I guess you could call it, of testing survey instruments against real people, of seeing how those questions are responded to, if they're interpreted correctly, and that kind of thing. So the collection of data that they get back is reliable because the mechanisms they use to put it together had that ability entrenched, but not everyone has that kind of large, well-funded capacity. So it's not a light task from our perspective.
Thank you. How does that look like from your perspective, Rob?
So data reliability, I think, well, I mean, you can start by working with a high quality, well-funded MSI supported sequencing facility. That always generates very good data. So that's a start. More generally, I think, if I think about it from the health side in our work, reliable data, it sort of depends on how we think about this term reliable. To me, what it means is data that is trustworthy and usable. And for us, I think there are maybe sort of three key elements. One is you need that data to be representative and inclusive and equitable. We need to make sure that data sets represent the people who are being asked to use the data, support the creation of the data, and so on. And certainly, that's not always the case when we think about human health data and genomics. Historically, of course, underrepresentation of all sorts of groups. So we have a collective responsibility to make sure that that data is representative so that when we run analyses with that data, we aren't getting biased results. And that certainly is even more true as we start to apply AI to these data sets. So I think that's absolutely core. The second piece is around the governance of that data, making sure that that data is being governed effectively, being able to rely on the controls that are in place. Talked about fair principles, but we want to think about governance that is able to balance privacy, individual privacy, with important and sort of innovative uses of that data. Thinking about effective governance for Indigenous peoples, for instance, First Nations OCAP principles when it comes to data, but other underrepresented groups where trust is very much justifiably in short supply when it comes to how data is being used. So governance is another key piece. And then the last piece, I think, is really about ensuring that data is actually being used. If we're going to ask people to trust the scientific community with the generation of data, the creation of data, we have a collective responsibility to make sure that data is being used in a way that is able to, try to kind of meet the hopes and dreams of the people giving us that permission. And so as institutions who are designed to collect data, use data, and so on, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to return the results to that community, and not just directly, but indirectly through new innovations, new understandings, and so on. And if you do that, the data becomes, I think, is seen as reliable by the public because it's being generated in a way that represents them, being governed effectively, and is being used in the way that they expect it to be used when they give us access to that data in the first place.
When we were having this similar conversations 3 years ago or 4 years ago, they were basically roughly human generated or human manipulated data. I mean, there could be sensors, right? But there was a technician that had put the sensor somewhere, and then you had, the aggregation of this data, and then it was utilized by human beings, and so the chain of custody, was data management, governance. I mean, these are still true today, but it's even more important now because we've got additional users and additional generators of data. So we've got more and more synthetic data that is generated, and we've got more synthetic users. We've got AI using this data. And to me, so I would just add, I mean, actually, it's implicit in what has been said so far, but you need highly qualified human beings vouching for how is the data collected or organized or used, not because they're going to be quicker or better than the AI, but because the AI doesn't have your interest at heart. And so you need, I think I've been pushing for, I really like, I use HQP all the time. But to me, they're highly qualified people. Like the people part is the most important one. You need human beings that are trained. It's not just having a human being in the recipe. And this is why the expertise, I'm thinking of érudit because that's the one I know most, but uh, you know, we generate great metadata. We're working on ways for having AI generate more and more of this metadata. But the real added value is going to have this HQP that can work in tandem to these tools that generate or utilize data in ways that can say, actually, what the platform generated is in your interest, or it's good, or it's coherent. But our role as experts is shifting, right? And this is in the question of data reliability, because data will be used at a scale that we've never seen in the history of humanity, right? The reliability takes an additional sense, and that can only be played by human beings. But we need to train these human beings. It's not just, and this is what we do. So the talent training aspect of our platforms has always been there, has been more or less important in the official presentation. But it's going to become only more strategic in vouching for either synthetic data or synthetic usages of data. And we're going to need people to defend our interests, our cognitive interests.
Absolutely.
And that will be the HQP we train.
I'm going to jump in there because I have to jump in on Frederick. I think HQP is so important, so I won't debate that. It's who we're training and how we're training them as well. I think we really have to look at in the context of these large infrastructures, because I know you've said that trust in experts still exists, but the public discourse around experts is not great and hasn't been for some time. So there is skepticism, and societal trust can shift so radically and unexpectedly sometimes in directions that we don't necessarily expect. And it's a bit of an embattled concept. I'm sure lots of us are going to talk about Carney's speech, but I'm not going to talk about middle powers. I was very positive in terms of how I felt very positively in terms of the reception of that speech, because it was so intellectually rich. And we haven't heard those kinds of speeches coming out of politicians for some time, and the attention to it and the celebration of it has been very high. So that gave me a little bit of a boost in terms of the idea of expertise as still having value. But we need to turn the tables a little bit on this waning trust in experts. And I think one of the key ways to do that is to really diversify the expertise, and better reflect a wider range of the population in our research infrastructures. So who are we training? What kind of lived experience are we bringing in? Are we able to attract different disciplinary perspectives on the same kind of data that we work with? How do we have the work that is being done and the people doing that work in the research infrastructure reflect the wider population a little more in a better way? And this isn't easy, and it's something that we're all looking at doing in different kinds of ways. But that's just, it's taking the opposite. Not how do we make experts better, but how do we find better ways to develop that expertise?
Thank you. We are talking for about 45 minutes, so I think it's either time for coffee or for question for you to have some interaction, actually. So we have, can we put that on the screen? One question for the audience. And please, no Mentimeter, just use your hands to discuss this with us. And also, just right after, please do not hesitate to stand up and to go to the mic to share with us your thoughts in reaction of what we heard or in relation, I have a feedback with this questions. So in your opinion, which level of action against misinformation is the priority and why? And there can be, of course, multiple choices. Please raise your hand if you think it's regulation, Or more time? Nobody thinks that? D, education. Thank you. C, technology. Oh, you need to explain that. D, cross-sexual collaboration. Thank you. Is it sometimes necessary to slow down innovation to protect the integrity of information? And would someone like to reflect on that, either from the audience or from you, to kick it off? Don't be shy.
Yeah, thanks for really really nice thoughts that are around and really important, I think. You mentioned the critical thinking earlier, and I guess this immediately also connects to AI, which is present everywhere, and where everybody is, of course, super happy about all the opportunities that are behind. But I'm strongly concerned by the fact that not too many people are really critically questioning what are the outcomes of it. And then also, today we still have really trained people around that can connect classical education with AI. But I'm really concerned for the future when, let's say, everybody is just a couch potato sitting in their matrix. And the critical thinking that we have nowadays is not there to connect it to good sounding outcomes from any chatbots. So I think this is a really important aspect where all the major infrastructures can really connect. So this kind of comes to your question, is it important to slow down innovation? I think the most important here is to realize what is happening and to try to connect people to come on a common page, as long as they are still enough humans to decide what AI can do. So I think we really need to be extremely careful here. So thanks for bringing this up.
Thank you, Heide. Thank you. Do you want? Yes, please go ahead.
Are you going to comment on that?
Well, I keep coming back to this idea that, and I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know if it's been supplanted by it must have been supplanted by something better. But I'm thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, when you're afraid or when you're threatened, you go on lower stages of the hierarchy of needs. So basically, I'm not going to put all the stages, but you begin with trying to ensure your survival and safety. And if that's guaranteed, then you go up the pyramid and it goes up to actualization, right? And so we're in a very peculiar moment because there's so much conflict and chaos that we're being kind of pushed down the pyramid, and we're becoming kind of, we're afraid or anxious. And when we get afraid or anxious, then you look for a silver bullet, and then it's AI. AI will solve everything or it will destroy everything, right? And then you say, well, no, no, like either way. And so I think the ability to maintain critical thinking when you're rattled, so I would just add, is in periods of uncertainty and fear, it's when you need most critical thinking and when it's most difficult to maintain because you're focusing on your survival and your security. How do we instill so many of us are parents, and many of us, we were discussing this over coffee. We're a bit concerned about level of anxiety that we see in youth, and we're saying, were we that anxious? Like, well, maybe I was, not focused on the right things, but part of it is, I think we have to be careful in how we communicate. Eh, When I was younger, we were talking about nuclear war between USSR and the US. Like, it wasn't better or worse, but this is not the first time that we're afraid. And we just had to try to communicate that we could do this. Like, this is not good. We need to do, things differently, environment and so on. Like, there are genuine challenges, But we need to add the sentence, but we can do this, right? Because we just to get us up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think critical thinking needs a bit of, I don't want to say optimism, but just kind of agency. You need to feel that your critical thinking can change behaviors in ways that are positive. And so I think we're in a peculiar time. We wouldn't have had the exact same conversation a year ago. How do we communicate, not just to our kids, but to community, that we can do this? That's the important part. So we could go up the pyramid, and then critical thinking about, well, this is not good, absolutely good. This is not absolutely bad. Is how do we want to use it? And then the question of culture, like the question of how do we enrich this thinking with more than just a tool, whether it's classical education or whether it's the arts or whether it's just empathy and social understanding of different cultures. There are various ways of achieving this. But right now we're being pushed down the pyramid.
Thank you. Baljit Singh, University of Saskatchewan. Really very good discussion, but I think I was expecting something else in the discussion, which we did not get to. Mistrust. It is the public. And people generally become mistrusting when they don't have the tools to deal with pieces of information that come to them. And that, of course, leads to all types of problems, from Second World War to in conflicts and polarization and everything in between. I believe that Canadian universities are highly disconnected from public. We are very insular institutions compared to universities I see in the States, land grant universities, for example, or in the developing countries from India to Nigeria to Kenya. The engagement of the public in the universities and these systems is very profound. People do believe that universities are connected to them, they give them knowledge, and they can become prosperous, more sustainable, you name it. I think in Canada, we do not have a mechanism. We get into the hiccups once in a while, like we are having a discussion today, but we have never really developed a comprehensive program where our professors go to public libraries, to go to small towns, to give talks. I do not know which university, which MSI has a program which runs every week that we do something in the public sphere. I do not know which university has created a program that tells every graduate student that you have to give one public presentation as part of your PhD MSc program and talk to somebody. Whole of the country is scrambling small communities to figure out what to do with AI. People are concerned. We read a news headline, we are going to lose jobs. Whose jobs? Who is going to get a job? Whose job will disappear? I think we owe it to Canadians to do something at that level, to launch a program where we get this information to small communities from northern Saskatchewan to Yukon, so that people can understand that. I think we are not doing that. And I do not know how to do it, but I have seen this being done in many places. I was at my alma mater in India last week. There were 300,000 people at the university in one single day debating science with the scientist as to how that thing did not work and why this thing is working. So I think we need to figure it out somehow. If we are going to have Canadians keep on funding our MSIs, MRFs, to make them even more relevant on the trust point. So I don't have an answer to that, though. I just wanted to lay out my point here. Thank you so very much.
It's a great idea. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Can I jump in a bit of what Baljit has to say? Thank you for the comments. I couldn't agree more. I think that in some ways we operate science in Canada and much of the West with sort of like a trickle-down economics kind of mentality, right? If you give smart people money and independence, they will do things that will create benefits that eventually just sprinkle through society and we all benefit. And I think that is true in some cases. but it's not true often enough to justify that approach to larger and larger pieces of the public. There's a sense that, well, wait a minute, how do we see ourselves reflected in this? We're spending billions of dollars a year in this country on public research. And that comes from people across Canada, pay their taxes and want to see that benefit. And that doesn't mean that everyone in the research community has to turn into widget makers that are just simply designed to turn that around into a product. Knowledge, scholarship matters. But I think this ability to open up our institutions to the public is essential. And the questions become, well, how do you do that, right? And some of the concepts you were describing, Baljit, around engagement with the public, whether it's universities or whether it's, MSIs or other institutions, I think is important. Asking questions about how we make funding decisions, the role of academic peer review balanced with input from public and ways of incorporating that perspective, I think will also be important for people to see themselves somehow reflected in the technology. And at the end of the day, I think people want to see themselves, sort of benefiting. I come back to this point because I think it's easy to say, well, there's mistrust in science, or we're seeing an increase in mistrust in science, but that's not true across the board. I mean, even the most fervent anti-vaxxers have cell phones in their pockets, which is using super advanced technologies, and they're allowing themselves to be tracked all over the place. It's an unbelievable level of trust in that science and technology, right? Millions of people handing their saliva samples over to 23andMe, right? To get, what was effectively sort of, party tricks of ancestry back, right? Giving away that really important data. Again, you might argue that was misplaced trust, right? But people are ready to trust. People are on waiting lists to get themselves into MRI machines across the province, right? So that's science, right? That's people willing to go in there. They don't know how MRI machines work, but they're going to go and use that because they see the real value and benefit to themselves. And so those cases, like MRI machine, there's an obvious, clear connection. It's not as obvious for all of us in this room how our institution has the same impact. But if we can make that connect, we see this in our public polling data that we've done. If we ask people, are you supportive of genomics and gene editing? Numbers are not super great, right? We've got 10% who think it's amazing no matter what, 10% who hate everything no matter what. But in a question like that, you get probably 50 or 60% who are not so sure. We don't like the idea of playing God, right? Well, sounds like a weird technology. How proven is it? But if we ask them about CAR T, the cell therapies for treating specific cancers, or we ask them about interventions in rare diseases made possible by this, the numbers skyrocket. All of a sudden, it's 80, 85% in support. So I think trust in science is a complicated subject, and thinking about how we can create that connection with the public goes a long way to helping them be more trustworthy, as opposed to well, I've got a lab coat, why don't you trust me anymore? Right? It's a different conception. I think it's important.
If I may bounce on that, is if you look at science policies, the points you were making about the trickle down of knowledge, right? When you look at science and science policy, it's not always called science strategy or science policy, but if you look throughout the 20th century and 21st century, most of it was focused on invention. I need a better tank. I need a better, because I'm in fighting with this other country. Then I need this new remedy or vaccine because my soldiers are sick. I'm making it militarily because initially that's what it was, right? At the beginning of 20th century, first science policies were military. Then it became industrial, right? And then it's how do we do technological transfer for economic growth? Then we shifted from invention to innovation, right? Now, I'm not saying we do tons of other things than that, but I'm just saying the science policy, the language shifted from invention and advantage to innovation. The next chapter will be talent. It'll be human people. Well, yeah, you have to be more specific to say, but no, but that's strangely prescient. But there'll be talent strategies. And when you think in terms of talent strategies, all the points we're making, it's not just, well, give us money, we'll generate knowledge, and somehow that knowledge will benefit your life. There was, I forget his name, but somebody from the Lalonde spectroscopy platform. But the point about SMEs in Quebec, the number of SMEs, and he was saying, basically, I need to speak with you to get the full argument. But you're saying basically our MSI generates HQP, generates talent. That's what you were saying. So give us more resources, we can generate more people. The laser was ancillary, right? The laser is how you generate the activity that generates HQP. But when you think about how you generate people, highly qualified people, then issues of trust and mistrust change completely, because they don't have to understand what exactly this machine does or how, but it really helps that, there's somebody who's going to help use this tool to get better outcomes for me. So the trust is fundamental. It's not actually, you don't trust science. You trust scientists. You can't trust an abstraction. So you trust people. So how do we train our specific role in training trustworthy people? To me, that's the key.
Very happy to see some other people.
You have a dual question from Miguel.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
It's of course now the trend is to talk about defense research and sovereignty. So the discussion around open science and how open science was supposed to bring back the trust in the science. But I'd like to hear you a bit more about citizen science in Canada. I was super surprised. That's why I have my computer, because recently I just opened one of the CCA emails that I received, and I saw that they are just about to examine the state of citizen science in Canada, and the sponsor is Public Services and Procurement Canada. So do you know anything about that, and what does it have to do with what we're discussing now?
Whoa.
CCA reps.
There are CCA people.
I want to talk about this.
Your point, yeah. Huh. Microphone.
Jeff Kinder with the Council of Canadian Academies. We were asked by Public Services and Procurement Canada, Labs Canada, to do an assessment on the state of citizen science. And we have just announced that we put together an expert panel, and we'll do the assessment and probably have a report out in about 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
So to the panel, then what's the role maybe of citizen science in addressing mistrust or
Well, Natalie, I know you have.
Well, I've been thinking about a couple of terms listening to you guys talk. One is citizen science and the other is science communication. And what's interesting about both of those concepts is they immediately presuppose a separation between the work of science as something that happens over there in that ivory tower versus what the public is doing. So there's a divide that is suggested by that terminology. And so I think the concept of citizen science is to try to break that down. But I don't get a sense that there's a huge... I'm curious to hear what the panel comes up with for Jeffco, because it's something I hear floating around, but not a lot in terms of implementation. And you said something, Dominique, about open science, but I don't know if you had a question there. Where'd you go?
Yeah, well, she said, yeah.
Just about citizen science.
Yeah.
Like one small point is that when you look science in Canada, if you look at the Royal Society of Canada and you look who was a fellow, actually for the first chapter of the Royal Society, most of them were hobbyists or were, public servants doing other things on the side. And then it shifted slowly. So actually, citizen science, if you look at Isaac Newton and the Royal Society on the other side of the pond, it was a very privileged citizen science, right? But so this is not new. The one thing that the power of science or sciences is the institutional mechanisms to test what is being said and done. And so it's the organized skepticism to take Robert Merton's, any sociologist in the room anyway, but but there's some institutional makeup. It's not that universities are intrinsically superior to any other organization of human society. But it's the practices that we've developed and adopted are very good. And it's very difficult to recreate them ad hoc or organically. So I would say there is genuinely a role for citizen science, but the institutional connection, kind of organized skepticism and sharing, needs to careful consideration. So it's not just people doing science. You want, ideally, people engaged in knowledge producing to be an epistemically robust process.
Spoken well by a philosopher. Okay, so what I'm interested in is science for citizens. And I want to just portray things I've seen over the years. The first ones, with huge congratulations to CFI, were the posters that I saw at one point. A farmer talking to this wonderful guy from, I guess, Saskatchewan, talking about how CFI was supporting his farming. Another was a big one in a window in Ottawa of women who had breast cancer sitting around a discussion group and saying, science has helped to cure these women. They were all citizens and they all portrayed what science had done for them. The next image is you go to China, there are museums of their famous scientists. The whole museum is a presentation of different individuals and the science they've done. So it's like going to see artwork. I mean, it's right out there for anybody to go to. The next one is in Berlin. Every fall, there's a week called Science Week. And you walk into a local restaurant and a scientist is speaking. You walk into a bank and in the lobby is a scientific presentation. The fourth image is one that I made up, but I still stick by it. At one point when Obama was elected, I think the second time, he said we have to get out of our bubbles. We live in a government bubble. We live in an academic bubble. We have to get out of the bubbles. That night that I heard that comment, I got off the bus near where I live, a place in Montreal called Westmount that's kind of Anglo and proper and all this. And there was a beaver tail truck right there at my bus stop on Sherbrooke Street. I thought, beaver tail truck doing in the middle of Westmount, like it was like a weekday night. And I thought, but I'm hungry, so I'm going to get one. So that started to get in my head. Why don't we have science trucks going around to the northeast corner of Montreal and talking about the kind of science that goes on to the great Heart Institute in their neighborhood? Why don't we send them to unexpected places? Those posters that I saw that CFI made were in big windows in Ottawa, were in the airport. I don't know how much they were out in regular people communities, but we have to find a way to figure out what the communications are that go into very typical citizen heads, whether it's in outlying regions, whether it's in cities, parts of cities, you would not expect this from.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about the northeast part of Montreal, it's inhabited by a large number of immigrants, many of whom work in health settings as préposés, as janitors, as cafeteria workers, etc. These people are serving the science literally on a tray to people who need the help of that science. So I think we have a huge and wonderful job about how we get out there in the mix of people. That's it. But you got to tell it simply. I worked a lot in the North with Inuit, and I had to teach them things. First, I had to learn from them because what did I know about their language? But second of all, these were people with some with no public school education, some with a tad of high school. They didn't know biology. We had to explain things to them like middle ear disease, which was rampant in their communities. So, you have to tell it in a way that is so simple, because once you penetrate where their questions are, you realize they have understood now. So you have to figure out really good ways to teach that bring things way down to a level that people can understand who've had limited education.
Thank you very much for bringing us this up and pulling us into these zones of thinking. Is there any reaction?
Yeah, I've just been trying to pull a few threads together from what you were saying, what Baljeet's questions around citizen science. As you were saying, going into small communities and having that kind of relationship. And I think sometimes it's difficult when you're working in a research infrastructure to figure out, how do I meet the people, right? The Joe Public or whatever. But the farmer poster probably came from a farmer association. The women who survived cancer probably came from a hospital treatment program. So there are community organizations that can connect you into these things. So some of the researchers, a lot of the researchers in our network will collaborate with not-for-profits. They'll collaborate with community organizations, with the Canadian Cancer Society, to address those very specific questions. So if you can find ways in through community groups, then you can also, those community groups can help to define the kinds of questions that are of interest to their participants. So I think if the idea of reaching the broad public seems difficult if we treat it en masse, but then there are other smaller ways into it.
Because science, it's also part of understanding the context in which you're doing the science. It gives you that social license to continue doing the science. And it's easy to think, oh, well, a poster at the airport, CFI, they're advertising to the minister when he's going to the lounge and they're going to whatever. It's like, but that thousands of people are normalizing that as part of their everyday thing. It's not just broadcast. And so as scholars, as scientists, as researchers, we need to integrate this as leaders as well, that this is key to what we do. It's not an add-on.
Thanks. We have another direction.
Oh. I'm a short person. Yeah, I just want to add probably a comment about the citizen science, and also to link to your comments, earlier comments. Well, I have participated in a couple of citizen science projects. So one with Sébastien Sauvé, which the society had to highlight when there was a bloom in lakes, like the cyanobacteria blooms, and then so our role was to test that water and to prove that there was a cyanobacteria. So that the cleansing, like what's the word? That will help the government create regulations and deal with the public safety, like the public health, the drinks that water. So it is important, and also related to the topic, involving people that will really involving them and to follow the process, like the research process. They will believe in that research. They will believe in the results, and they will apply because they are involved. And just in the second project that I involved since 2020, probably. So it's bird watching. And so we have a couple of applications, and then we submit what we see, and that helps, to protect the migration of birds. And so, and I believe in that, and I'm every week I do that. So, but we need people that validate that data, because I have a couple of errors. So they had to contact me and say hey, show us a picture why you're, detecting this bird, and it's not supposed to be there. And then we have this conversation, and then it was my error. But I'm not an expert yet. But so we need these people to validate that data in order to be, good data and reliable data. Thank you.
Those are really good examples and very fruitful cases of partnership with citizens to conduct the science. But they most of them are examples, not the last one. The last one I think was a different type, but in the medical sector, you've got patient partenaire, partner patients. The example with Sébastien Sauvé, where the citizen living around the lakes takes samples. And so those are amazing partnerships. And I think they're very fruitful. Where it gets more complicated, I'm just putting the question mark, I don't know how to address this, is there's also a movement, small, because like you were saying, it's not tons of people wanting to do this, but citizens outside of any contact with other researchers wanting support to do their science project. And that's, to me, and this is something that's marginal, but it's there. And to me, that's kind of trickier to get my head around in terms of how should, and again, that question, how should governments conceive of how they support scientific enterprise, not just on campuses, but how they should support, private research. They do it through tax credits mainly, but it's a big question on how governments should support scientific enterprise and what should be seen as a personal activity that's not worthy of not eligible for support, and what activities are. And I'll be looking at the report from CCA to. I hope you address it. I'm just teasing, but it's these are big questions about how do we support the different people that are involved in a scientific enterprise. But the wins of doing so for scientists, it broadens the point you were making, that it's not just an afterthought. These components actually amplify what you can do.
Yep.
We have 10 minutes left, and I have one last question, but there are two people at the mic. We want to hear you. Actually, yes, please come back. So you agree that we?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, yes.
All right. I just want to very briefly, I've been hearing everybody's comments, and I just have been so fascinated by the discussion. And hopefully tomorrow, when I'm do the workshop on science communication, we can get into the nitty gritty a little bit. But one thing I've been hearing from everybody is this sort of common theme that I would be calling outreach. And it's not necessarily education. It's not necessarily teaching the public or teaching people something. It's kind of a combination of opening ourselves up and making ourselves accessible, and also meeting people where they are physically, knowledge-wise, even emotionally. And so I just sort of wanted to kind of make that connection, especially even too with understanding where the public's coming from. The comment about bubbles was very meaningful to me, because especially in social media, the way the algorithms feed you content tends to silo people to reinforce pre-existing beliefs. Even in our own social media feeds, we are siloed necessarily. So we don't always get an idea of what's happening outside of our little corner of social media. So just some ideas to think about. And I just been fabulous listening to you the discussion. So that's all I want to say. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
So my name's Christina Aquino. I am the Vice President of External Relations and Comms at the CFI. For about a year, I'd say I'm new, but that ship has sailed now. It's been about a year. But one thing I just wanted to mention, because Martha, when she was talking, tipped me off. One really excellent communications campaign that was done a few years ago to really bring science to Canadians was from the CFIA. They created a superhero, Science of Superheroes program that they used on social media and on LinkedIn. They used their scientists as superheroes to be able to tell the importance about food safety, how they test food, the research that they do. And I was the head of communications at the NRC at the time. We were like, darn, why didn't we think of doing something like that? And we spoke to the CFIA about how successful that campaign was to really drill down to the public sector. They did a phenomenal job with that. So all that to say is never underestimate or never think that your campaign is too simple to get out there, especially on larger platforms like social media and maybe even some media buying. Because it really, on a topic as important as food safety, it's really important for people to understand that. So think of a way to really connect with the public. And I'm just building on what Martha said about that. It's finding a way of finding that platform and finding that campaign that's really going to resonate with Canadians. It goes a long way. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. I feel that we have a lot of homework and material to come back next year, actually. Just finish this. I have one very last question, if you can just shortly respond to it. What do you think is, how can we improve the link between research, scientific evidence, and public policy. We touched on that a little bit, but maybe we can finish over this thought, the panel. Do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of our research overlaps with everyday public policy. It's very relevant. But getting the right information into the right hands is always challenging. So it's a different kind of challenge than the public communication. It's around engaging policymakers. There's things you can do, right? Part of it is science communication and developing. We develop research snapshots. My director of research is here that try to whittle down the findings of the paper to put it into that context. We've developed collaborative research programs with government departments so they can set up the questions that they need answered, and we can go find the researchers that can help to do that kind of work. So there's a lot of mechanisms for this kind of thing. But I think, and I'm going to tell a very brief anecdote. What's interesting to me is how strategic you have to be no matter what kind of mechanism you're looking for. So I was at a keynote talk by Professor Juliette Gerard. I don't know if anyone knows her, but she was the ex-chief science advisor to 3 different prime ministers in New Zealand. And her talk was about how do you get the attention of policymakers. So, we've got the whole audience today, and we're like, what are we going to find out in terms of the gem that she can share with us? And in the end, what she said is the most important thing you can do is to time your advice to hit government funding cycles. And she said, so of course you have to have good advice and you have to figure out how to package it. But if you're not getting it into the right moment, there's not much of a chance that it's going to be picked up. So she had this entire wealth of advice about how she directed COVID responses and everything during that crisis. And in the end, the single most important piece was that. So that is not to end on any kind of cynical financial note, but it does suggest that you still have to look at the strategic angle because it's challenging. Yeah.
Thank you, Natalie. Rob?
Yeah, I think so in terms of engagement on policy, public policy for science leaders, science organizations, I think there's sort of 2 elements. On the policy side, and they're kind of related. So the policy side implies government, and you're working with government, and you're working with those who fund us, or those who are trying to advance policies that reflect the promises they've made to the electorate, right? And that's at the end of the day, they're there to represent that public. And I've been doing this for a long time, working at that kind of science policy nexus. And the thing I've learned actually, and timing, of course, matters. There's no doubt about that. But for me, the biggest thing is actually to listen to what you're being told. And I think that there's just generally a tendency on the science side, like in science communications, we sort of think there's like this information deficit. Like if you knew what I knew, you would come to the same conclusions I've come to. So I have to make sure you know what I know, and then you'll just think like me, right? And it doesn't work that way. Everyone has their own context, the heuristics they're using to come to their conclusions, the set of pressures that they're getting from other sources that you don't necessarily appreciate. You need to listen to that so that you also understand the context in which your advice is being given. So the idea that as a scientist, you can walk in and be like, we need to make these policy changes because this is the right answer to get the outcome that I think is important. Well, that's all well and fine, Poindexter, but I've got a bunch of other things I'm worrying about right now in terms of like affordability, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need a lot of humility to be able to also listen to the context so that we can understand how can we help. I don't need to tell you what you should do. I've got a whole set of knowledge and expertise and information in my network at my disposal that I can bring to bear on the things you care about and the things that you're trying to advance, right? 6 months ago, we weren't all in the defense sector, right? And today, suddenly it turns out we're all doing dual use and whatever. That's because we can't help but listen, given the noise south of the border. But it's the reality is we're responding to that public moment, right? There's no sense, not only to be cynical about it, the reality is that's the policy need at the moment. How can we help? And I think that that's the question, that instead of going into public policy makers and saying like, here's what you should be doing, here's why you should give me money, here's what we need in my community. It's like, here's what I can bring to the table to help you advance the policy objectives you've committed to for your public. And we're here to help. And I think that goes us a long way on the policy side.
Très brièvement, Frédéric?
I'll take it. Good luck. I'll take it slightly differently because the points were, I think, were excellent about how to achieve this. I just assume that there's no goal that this country can give itself that can be achieved without better privileged access to I'll say to scientists, broadly construed. Okay, you cannot achieve your industrial goals without a lot of R&D. That R&D will depend on expertise that we're developing in our infrastructure, in our universities, and so on. There's no security policy that can be achieved without more better science, and there's no social policy that can be achieved without correctly understanding. Take any policy, right? And this is going to be even more true because we're not in a trickle-down mirage that knowledge can be produced anywhere and it will flow to us somehow. We need to generate it ourselves, or we need to manipulate it ourselves. So, three-point action plan, and this will be non-aspirational or non-philosophical, if you will. So, first of all, we really, really need a science and innovation strategy. Holy crap, we're a G7 country. We don't have, many provinces do. Quebec has an amazing strategy, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. We don't have it. So step one, just say there are all these policies in government. Somehow they should connect and to a science and innovation strategy. The next two steps, I saw a lot of head nodding. The next two steps, you'll give you like, what? No, this, but follow me on this. Step two, one of the items of the science and innovation strategy should be, we want a higher number of masters and PhDs. Take whatever diplomas the diploma itself is not important, but you just say, you put a goal in terms of talent training and say, we want to increase our target on this metric. And we don't want them to be only in universities. Like the second part is really important. So you say, actually, if knowledge is that important, it shouldn't be restricted to campuses. So you want your students to be elsewhere in society. Step three, you need incentives for organizations to hire these people. If you ask an SME to hire a PhD, they say, I'd love to. I don't have the budget, or I don't know what. So this is, and I'm throwing this, and I'm happy to discuss it. I'm probably wrong on this last one. I would shave off $1 billion of SR&ED tax credits and transform into direct salary support for highly qualified people. So that way, if you're a small business and you have no idea how you're going to access markets in Malaysia, but you get some salary support to hire, a master's student or a PhD student that studied, Malaysia, you're going to be better equipped. And so it's not so much just to inform policy. I think any and all collective goals we set our minds to, you will need some sort of aggressive talent strategy. And so step one, science innovation strategy. Step two, put a talent item there. And step three, put right incentives, not tax credits. Only big companies can take advantage of these tax credits. So, or the usual suspects. You want to help the people who don't hire masters and PhD students right now. You hire them so you increase their capacity.
Give it to CSI. We're at the end of our hour now. I'm cutting it short there, but sorry for that. But I really would like to say a huge thank you to you as panelists, to CFI, to the Coalition Public Care team, and to you for participating in that way. Thank you very much.